Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of RNC Woodworking and Design. This week we're going to be tackling a massive beam console. This one started out as a request from a customer for a custom piece that she had seen in some of the big, chain stores. However, after discussing things with her, we wanted to try and use a tree that had already come down in her yard. And so we ended up using, it was actually a 45-foot tall white oak tree. And this came literally fresh from the mill. I was there, I helped mill it all up. It ended up being 15 inches across by 9 inches deep. And then there were two, one was 12 foot, one was 14 foot long beams. And all of them, each of them weighed about 1,200 pounds. Cutting through them, even though they had already been sitting at the mill for about 3 years to dry out some, they were still very high in moisture, and they were about 55% moisture content, and when they were first cut they were somewhere around 75 or 80. So they'd come a long way, but it took an awful lot of effort to try and cut everything down, which is why I started to work smarter rather than harder, as you can see here. I had one beam already up on a cart. This one happened to be sitting on some furniture dollies, so I ended up using literally a car jack to try and lift this thing up. It was the smartest way I could think of to efficiently lift things, and this project was full of work smarter, not harder moments, and you'll see why as things progress. Here, as you can see, I'm using the chainsaw to cut the legs of what will end up being the full console. I had to support it on both sides. I ended up using both the car jacks and some extra blocks of wood, but the chainsaw was definitely the most efficient way, but it was messy. Here's another example of work smarter, not harder. I have a rolling table that I use for an outfeed table on my planer, but I ended up bringing it over to the bandsaw to support the weight of these feet so I could cut them as square as I possibly could. And trying to maneuver everything and level it all out, and at the time these feet weighed around 250 pounds, so just trying to move them around was a beast. From there I used a laser level to mark everything out completely square, and then I ended up taking everything back over to the bandsaw to cut them exactly square and down to final size. Moving these pieces around the shop was no easy task, but in the end I actually didn't have to go to the gym for a few weeks. At this point it was time to clean up the sapwood and a little bit of bark that was still there after the milling. So I went old school, pulled out the draw knife, and sometimes it's nice to just slow down a little bit, actually do things the old school way. It gives you a little bit of peace, a little bit of serenity, and it forces you to slow down and think about what you're doing. As I'm starting to lay out these ends here, these are the feet, so I'm actually going to lay out what are going to be the side walls, and as you'll see in the next shot, I actually measure out the back walls right here. Then I had to transfer those same measurements onto the actual beam that'll be the top. So I'm doing one side, and then you'll see me do the other in just a sec. You're looking right now at what is going to be the bottom side of the beam. So first we have to cut the shoulder and then hog out the material that'll end up creating the area for the tenon of the dovetail to sit inside the mortise. I ended up having to use a handsaw to cut down the final depth of the shoulder simply because my circular saw only went so far. So this is the best way I could think of to actually clear out and make sure I had a solid cut all the way down. I'm sure if you're like me and you've seen timber framing videos before, you've seen guys basically etch out what their waste is going to be and they use a hammer and knock out the excess. That works great on pine, doesn't work as well on white oak. Unfortunately, I had to try a few different methods to get this to work, but as you can see, I switched to a router to make sure that I could get an even cut, but it didn't go deep enough. The router worked with the extension acrylic piece on there to be able to get everything flat, as you can see here. But that's about half the depth that I actually needed. So I used a circular saw to set my final depth. Then I came back with a hand plane to flush everything up. Once I had a flat surface on there, I was able to come back with my track saw to make sure that I could cut out the relief after that. Once again, as you can see, just the hammer method isn't exactly working with this white oak. So I ended up getting the biggest chisel I have and working with that to then pry up the excess. Now that the bottom side of this beam is done, it's time to flip it over. And as you can see here, trying to lift it up on my own isn't going to work, so I have to use a little bit of leverage. Once again, work smarter, not harder. Now I'm laying out the dovetail that'll end up being the focal point of this piece. I ended up going with a 1/6 dovetail, which means 1 inch of rise over 6 inches of depth. So now that I had laid that out, I have to cut off the excess. So I'm starting out with the circular saw. Once I laid out the center point of this dovetail, I realized that I had made it far too large and that it wasn't going to fit on the feet. So I ended up having to re-lay out this entire piece and recut those shoulders again. I ended up switching to the American style, just standard back saw. The Japanese saw just wasn't hogging out enough product, and this had a much more aggressive cut. So for this kind of thing, where I wasn't worried about the extreme precision because of the size of this piece, this was actually the perfect tool. But I will say, this white oak gave me a hell of a workout the entire time. I ended up coming back with a chisel just to clean up the line between the depth of the circular saw and where the hand saw could get to. As you can see, there's still a lot of moisture left in this wood, and as soon as I cut back those edges, it exposed what the moisture really was. Finally, I came back just with a block plane to chamfer all the edges, make sure nothing chipped off in the end. One thing I found in the woodworking industry is it's great to have friends. This is actually one of our neighbors who happens to have an electric forklift, and lifting up this 1,200-pound beam multiple times proved to be much more difficult than I expected. So having the use of this forklift made it so much easier. We ended up being able to use a forklift to lift the beam into place so that I could transfer the dovetails onto the feet and I could start working on those afterwards. I initially used my portable circular saw to cut out the shoulders on these to make sure that everything was actually cut on the exact line I needed to. I have to admit, this circular saw, even though it's about 20 years old, barely kept up with the tension of these legs. There was something about these legs and the beam that they came from that just fought me the entire way. My typical method for hogging out a mortise is to use a Forstner bit. So I thought, hey, why not use a massive Forstner bit that I got from Wood River? This is a 3 1/4 inch Forstner bit, and I figured I could make a few passes and hog everything out. But you're gonna see in a second, this method didn't work. This wood just did not want to cut no matter what I did. So I switched over to the router, and as you can hear, it didn't like that either. After getting the cut to the initial depth, I came back with the chisel just to make sure that I cleaned up all the shoulders, cleaned up all the edges. From there, I was actually able to come back with a router that had an edge guide to a flush trim bit, and I hogged out as much as I could, sticking to that line. One tool I don't use very often, but was actually the perfect tool for this job, was this flush trimmer. I was able to use it to come underneath all these different pieces, cut as far in depth as I possibly could, and then I would come back with the chisel, as you can see here, and knock out the excess. This worked pretty well, but it was a very monotonous task. It took a lot of time to be able to get to the right depth. Because I was going directly into end grain of white oak, I actually had to sharpen my chisels about twice a day just to be able to make sure they were sharp enough to go through this. Because of the moisture content and the tension here, I had so many issues fighting against this white oak. As I was posting progress about this on Instagram, I had a ton of people telling me I need to use a chainsaw to cut this, but truthfully, as you can see, the chainsaw that I have is a 27-inch blade, and I didn't trust myself. So once again, I came back and I laid out everything with the circular saw, or the track saw here, to be able to make sure I got exact lines where I needed to be, and to make sure I could control the depth and the cut all the way across. So I tried the checkerboard method, where you basically make relief cuts going both ways, and I would come in with a chisel to then chip everything out. Needless to say, as you can see, that method didn't work. So I went back to my tried and true method of using the flush trimmer. It worked a little bit, but not great. flush trimmer is made for obviously trimming out a door frame when you're trying to put in flooring. This thing was working so hard over time that I ended up having to put gloves on because it was heating up so much. So finally I got fed up with it and I went to Harbor Freight and bought an electric chainsaw, something a little bit more manageable. And although it was a bit crude, because I had the blue tape markings on there, it was easy to follow where I needed to go. So I was able to hog out the majority of things here. It wasn't the sexiest way to do it, but I have to admit, when you guys are right, you're right. You guys are right. After getting a new blade, then it was back to the final cleanup utilizing the flush trimmer. Now came the most dangerous part of this build. It was the fact that I was going to have to be lifting up this beam multiple times to try and size it and fit it correctly into each of the feet. I probably lifted this thing between 30 to 40 times repeatedly just to do a little bit more etching, a little bit more sizing. And that constant movement of a beam this size, that's when accidents occur, which you'll see happened a little later. This is the method I would use every single time I had to do a refit. I would etch out where I thought it was tight, then I would go lift this beam back up, bring it back over to the bench, try and cut off a little bit more, but not too much. Obviously, you want to make sure it's still a snug fit. You guys have probably also noticed that I'm not calling my neighbor every time I needed to lift this beam. The same day that I bought the electric chainsaw, I also bought an engine hoist from Harbor Freight. It ended up being one of the best tools for the job. Outside of having to try and maneuver it, the strength of it is something I never worried about. And this is the method that I use constantly. I would try and lower it into the feet. I would mark where I saw that everything was tight. I would lift it back up, bring it over to the bench, rinse and repeat. We did find with the engine hoist though that if you didn't have the weight perfectly centered, sometimes one side would get wedged into the feet as you were trying to lift it up. So you had to kind of go back and forth and balance everything. We ended up making a mark at exact center on this beam to make sure we knew exactly where everything lined up. It's okay, that was my fault. Can you lift it up, please? And here she is, finally fit into the feet. Looks like a dream. Who says looks like a dream? What am I, 90? Good Lord. Now with the excess length of the other beam that ended up being the legs, I was able to cut out 2 end tables. So once again, I went back to the faster method of using the chainsaw, cut everything to rough length, and was able to then use a router sled to get everything perfectly level. Got to put that glamour shot in there. Who doesn't love seeing a good branding iron happen? At the same time, I ended up putting a brand on the underside of both of the end tables. Then I put a light chamfer on the edges of all the end tables just to make sure if they ever got moved around, nothing would chip off. Finally, we're ready for stain. We ended up going with a Varathane Early American finish, and it was a 2-step process. I would first come through with a brush everything on, then I came through with a microfiber cloth and I would smooth everything out so there were no brush marks. You had an even finish all the way across the piece. As for polyurethane, I ended up using the Varathane water-based polyurethane. I ended up putting 3 coats onto this piece and 3 coats onto the end tables as well. As you can see, it goes on blue, but it dries crystal clear. That's just to help you know where you've sprayed it. And here she is. The final piece is done. That finish is a semi-gloss. It looks absolutely astounding, and it's ready for delivery. I have to admit, out of all the projects I've ever done, I've never actually had more requests of how the hell are you going to deliver something than I did for this piece. Well, this is what we ended up doing. We took 2 8-quarter slabs that I had from milling up this same tree, ended up putting them down as a ramp from the trailer into the house. First, we used a hand truck to unload everything. We started with the smaller pieces, then from there we were able to bring in the engine hoists. From the trailer to be able to lift the beam, we actually started by utilizing the crane that we've installed on the trailer. From there, we were able to lift it up onto a furniture dolly on the ramp, 1 dolly at a time, working our way all the way down. Once we were inside the house with the beam, all we had to do was roll it over on the furniture dollies, bring over the engine hoist, and lift it into place. There you have it, folks. This is the before picture of what was there, and this is the after. If you ask me, this tied the room together so well. This piece came out unbelievably well. I'm so proud of it. It's so simple, yet so elegant. It was a ton of fun to build. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I had building it. And stay tuned for more videos soon. We'll catch you on the next one.